thevoicebeforethevoid.net. Clothe the Naked by Dorothy Parker. Big Lanny went out by the day to the houses of secure and leisured ladies, to wash their silks and their linens. She did her work perfectly. Some of the ladies even told her so. She was a great, slow mass of a woman, colored a sound brown-black, save for her palms and the flat of her fingers that were like gutta percha from steam and hot suds. She was slow because of her size, and because the big veins in her legs hurt her, and her back ached much of the time. She neither cursed her ills nor sought remedies for them. They had happened to her. There they were. Many things had happened to her. She had had children, and the children had died. So had her husband, who was a kind man, cheerful with the little luck he found. None of their children had died at birth. They had lived to be 4 or 7 or 10, so that they had had their ways and their traits and their means of causing love. And Big Lanny's heart was always wide for love. One child had been killed in a street accident, and 2 others had died of illnesses that might have been no more than tedious, had there been fresh food and clear spaces and clean air behind them. Only Arlene, the youngest, lived to grow up. Arlene was a tall girl, not so dark as her mother, but with the same firm flatness of color. She was so thin that her bones seemed to march in advance of her body. Her little pipes of legs and her broad feet with jutting heels were like things a child draws with crayons. She carried her head low, her shoulders scooped around her chest, and her stomach slanted forward. Big Lanny did not know it when Arlene was going to have a baby. Arlene had not been home in nearly half a year. Big Lanny told the time in days. There was no news at all of the girl until the people at the hospital sent for Big Lanny to come to her daughter and grandson. She was there to hear Arlene say the baby must be named Raymond, and to see the girl die. He was a long, light-colored baby, with big, milky eyes that looked right back at his grandmother. It was several days before the people at the hospital told her he was blind. Big Lanny went to each of the ladies who employed her and explained that she could not work for some while. She must take care of her grandson. The ladies were sharply discommoded after her steady years, but they dressed their outrage in shrugs and cool tones. Each arrived, separately, at the conclusion that she had been too good to Big Lanny, and had been imposed upon, therefore. Honestly, those people, each said to her friends, they're all alike. Big Lanny sold most of the things she lived with, and took one room with a stove in it. There, as soon as the people at the hospital would let her, she brought Raymond and tended him. He was all her children to her. She had always been a saving woman, with few needs and no cravings, and she had been long alone. Even after Arlene's burial, there was enough left for Raymond and Big Lanny to go on for a time. Big Lanny was slow to be afraid of what must come. Fear did not visit her at all, at first, and then it slid in only when she waked, when night hung motionless before another day. Raymond was a good baby, a quiet, patient baby, lying in his wooden box and stretching out his delicate hands to the sounds that were light and color to him. It seemed but a little while, so short to Big Lanny, before he was walking about the room, his hands held out, his feet quick and sure. Those of Big Lanny's friends who saw him for the first time had to be told that he could not see. Then, and it seemed again such a little while, he could dress himself, and open the door for his granny, and unlace the shoes from her tired feet, and talk to her in his soft voice. She had occasional employment. Now and then a neighbor would hear of a day's scrubbing she could do, or sometimes she might work in the stead of a friend who was sick, infrequent and not to be planned on. She went to the ladies for whom she had worked, to ask if they might not want her back again. But there was little hope in her, after she had visited the first one. "Well, now, really," said the ladies. "Well, really, now." The neighbors across the hall watched over Raymond while Big Lanny looked for work. He was no trouble to them, nor to himself. He sat and crooned at his chosen task. He had been given a wooden spool, around the top of which were driven little brads, and over these, with a straightened hairpin, he looped bright worsted, working faster than sight, until a long tube of woven wool fell through the hole in the spool. The neighbors threaded big, blunt needles for him, and he coiled the wooden tubes and sewed them into mats. Big Lanny called them beautiful, and it made Raymond proud to have her tell him how readily she sold them. It was hard for her, when he was asleep at night, to unravel the mats and wash the worsted and stretch it so straight that even Raymond's shrewd fingers could not tell, when he worked with it next day, that it was not new. Fear stormed in Big Lanny, and took her days and nights. She might not go to any organization dispensing relief, for fear that Raymond would be taken from her and put in. She would not say the word to herself, and she and her neighbors lowered their voices when they said it to one another. An institution. The neighbors wove lingering tales of what happened inside certain neat, square buildings on the cindery skirts of the town, and, if they must go near them, hurried, as if passing graveyards, and came home heroes. "When they got you in one of those places," whispered the neighbors, "they laid your spine open with whips, and then when you dropped, they kicked your head in." Had anyone come into Big Lanny's room to take Raymond away to an asylum for the blind, the neighbors would have fought for him with stones and rails and boiling water. Raymond did not know about anything but good. When he grew big enough to go alone down the stairs and into the street, he was certain of delight each day. He held his head high as he came out into the little yard in front of the flimsy wooden house, and slowly turned his face from side to side, as if the air were soft liquid in which he bathed it. Trucks and wagons did not visit the street, which ended in a dump for rusted bedsprings and broken boilers and staved-in kettles. Children played over its cobbles, and men and women sat talking in open windows and called across to one another in gay, rich voices. There was always laughter for Raymond to hear, and he would laugh back and hold out his hands to it. At first, the children stopped their play when he came out, and gathered quietly about him, and watched him, fascinated. They had been told of his affliction, and they had a sort of sickened pity for him. Some of them spoke to him in soft, careful tones. Raymond would laugh with pleasure, and stretch his hands, the curious, smooth, flat hands of the blind, to their voices. They would draw sharply back, afraid that his strange hands might touch them. Then, somehow ashamed because they had shrunk from him, and he could not see that they had done so, they said gentle goodbyes to him, and backed away into the street again, watching him steadily. When they were gone, Raymond would start on his walk to the end of the street. He guided himself, lightly touching the broken fences along the dirt sidewalk. And as he walked, he crooned little songs with no words to them. Some of the men and women at the windows would call hello to him, and he would call back and wave and smile. When the children, forgetting him, laughed again at their games, he stopped and turned to the sound as if it were the sun. In the evening, he would tell Big Lanny about his walk, slapping his knee and chuckling at the memory of the laughter he had heard. When the weather was too hard for him to go out in the street, he would sit at his worsted work and talk all day of going out the next day. The neighbors did what they could for Raymond and Big Lanny. They gave Raymond clothes their own children had not yet worn out, and they brought food when they had enough to spare, and other times. Big Lanny would get through a week, and would pray to get through the next one, and so the months went. Then the days on which she could find work fell farther and farther apart, and she could not pray about the time to come because she did not dare to think of it. It was Mrs. Ewing who saved Raymond's and Big Lanny's lives, and let them continue together. Big Lanny said that then and ever after. Daily she blessed Mrs. Ewing, and nightly she would have prayed for her, had she not known, in some dimmed way, that any intercession for Mrs. Delabere Ewing must be impudence. Mrs. Ewing was a personage in the town. When she went to Richmond for a visit, or when she returned from viewing the azalea gardens in Charleston, the newspaper always printed the fact. She was a woman rigorously conscious of her noble obligation. She was prominent on the community chest committee, and it was she who planned and engineered the annual bridge drive to raise funds for planting salvia around the cannon in front of the DAR headquarters. These, and many others, were her public activities, and she was no less exacting of herself in her private life. She kept a model, though childless, house for her husband and herself, relegating the supervision of details to no domestic lieutenant, no matter how seemingly trustworthy. Back before Raymond was born, Big Lanny had worked as laundress for Mrs. Ewing. Since those days, the Ewing washtubs had witnessed many changes, none for the better. Mrs. Ewing took Big Lanny back into her employment. She apologized for this step to her friends by the always winning method of self-deprecation. She knew she was a fool, she said, after all that time, and after the way that Big Lanny had treated her. But still, she said, and she laughed a little at her own ways. Anyone she felt kind of sorry for could always get around her, she said. She knew it was awful foolish, but that, she said, was the way she was. Mr. Ewing, she said outside her husband's hearing, always called her just a regular little old easy mark. 2 days' work in the week meant money for rent and stovewood, and almost enough food for Raymond and Big Lanny. She must depend, for anything further, on whatever odd jobs she could find, and she must not stop seeking them. Pressed on by fear and gratitude, she worked so well for Mrs. Ewing that there was sometimes expressed satisfaction at the condition of the lady's household linen and her own and her husband's clothing. Big Lanny had a glimpse of Mr. Ewing occasionally, leaving the house as she came, or entering it as she was leaving. He was a bit of a man, not much bigger than Raymond. Raymond grew so fast they seemed to be taller each morning. Every day he had his walk in the street to look forward to and experience and tell Big Lanny about at night. He had ceased to be a sight of the street. The children were so used to him that they did not even look at him, and the men and women at the windows no longer noticed him enough to hail him. He did not know. He would wave to any gay cry he heard, and go on his way, singing his little songs and turning toward the sound of laughter. Then his lovely list of days ended, as sharply as if ripped from some bright calendar. A winter came, so sudden and savage as to find no comparison in the town's memories, and Raymond had no clothes to wear out in the street. Big Lanny mended his outgrown garments as long as she could, but the stuff had so rotted with wear that it split in new places when she tried to sew together the ragged edges of rents. The neighbors could give no longer. All they had they must keep for their own. A demented colored man in a nearby town had killed the woman who employed him, and the terror had spread like brush fire. There was a sort of panic in reprisal. Colored employees were dismissed from their positions, and there was no new work for them. But Mrs. Ewing, admittedly soft-hearted, certainly to a fault, and possibly to a peril, kept her black laundress on. More than ever, Big Lanny had reason to call her blessed. All winter, Raymond stayed indoors. He sat at his spool and worsted, with Big Lanny's old sweater about his shoulders, and, when his tattered knickerbockers would no longer hold together, a calico skirt of hers lapped round his waist. He lived, at his age, in the past, in the days when he had walked, proud and glad, in the street, with laughter in his ears. Always, when he talked of it, he must laugh back at that laughter. Since he could remember, he had not been allowed to go out when Big Lanny thought the weather unfit. This he had accepted without question, and so he accepted his incarceration through the mean weeks of the winter. But then one day it was spring, so surely that he could tell it even in the smoky, stinking rooms of the house, and he cried out with joy, because now he might walk in the street again. Big Lanny had to explain to him that his rags were too thin to shield him, and that there were no odd jobs for her, and so no clothes and shoes for him. Raymond did not talk about the street any more, and his fingers were slow at his spool. Big Lanny did something she had never done before. She begged of her employer. She asked Mrs. Ewing to give her some of Mr. Ewing's old clothes for Raymond. She looked at the floor and mumbled, so that Mrs. Ewing requested her to talk up. When Mrs. Ewing understood, she was, she said, surprised. She had, she said, a great many demands on her charity, and she would have supposed that Big Lanny, of all people, might have known that she did everything she could. In fact, a good deal more. She spoke of inches and ells. She said that if she found she could spare anything, Big Lanny was kindly to remember that it was to be just for this once. When Big Lanny was leaving at the end of her day's work, Mrs. Ewing brought her a package with her own hands. There, she said, was a suit and a pair of shoes. Beautiful, grand things that people would think she was just crazy to be giving away like that. She simply didn't know, she said, what Mr. Ewing would say to her for being such a crazy. She explained that that was the way she was when anyone got around her. All the while, Big Lanny was trying to thank her. Big Lanny had never before seen Raymond behave as he did when she brought him home the package. He jumped and danced and clapped his hands. He tried to squeak and squealed instead. He tore off the paper himself and ran his fingers over the close-woven cloth and held it to his face and kissed it. He put on the shoes and clattered about in them, digging with his toes and heels to keep them on. He made Big Lanny pin the trousers around his waist and roll them up over his shins. He babbled of the morrow when he would walk in the street, and he could not say his words for laughing. Big Lanny must work for Mrs. Ewing the next day, and she had thought to bid Raymond wait until she could stay at home and dress him herself in his new garments. But she heard him laugh again. She could not tell him he must wait. He might go out at noon next day, she said, when the sun was so warm that he would not take cold at his first outing. One of the neighbors across the hall would help him with the clothes. Raymond chuckled and sang his little songs until he went to sleep. After Big Lanny left in the morning, the neighbor came in to Raymond, bringing a pan of cold pork and cornbread for his lunch. She had a call for a half-day's work, and she could not stay to see him start out for his walk. She helped him put on the trousers and pinned and rolled them for him, and she laced the shoes as snug as they would go on his feet. Then she told him not to go out till the noon whistles blew, and kissed him and left. Raymond was too happy to be impatient. He sat and thought of the street and smiled and sang. Not until he heard the whistles did he go to the drawer where Big Lanny had laid the coat, and take it out and put it on. He felt it soft on his bare back. He twisted his shoulders to let it fall warm and loose from them. As he folded the sleeves back over his thin arms, his heart beat so that the cloth above it fluttered. The stairs were difficult for him to manage in the big shoes, but the slowness of the descent was delicious to him. His anticipation was like honey in his mouth. Then he came out into the yard and turned his face in the gentle air. It was all good again. It was all given back again. As quickly as he could, he gained the walk and set forth, guiding himself by the fence. He could not wait. He called out so that he would hear gay calls in return. He laughed so that laughter would answer him. He heard it. He was so glad that he took his hand from the fence and turned and stretched out his arms and held up his smiling face to welcome it. He stood there, and his smile died on his face, and his welcoming arms stiffened and shook. It was not the laughter he had known. It was not the laughter he had lived on. It was like great flails beating him flat, great prongs tearing his flesh from his bones. It was coming at him, to kill him. It drew slyly back, and then it smashed against him. It swirled around and over him, and he could not breathe. He screamed and tried to run through it, and fell, and it licked over him, howling higher. His clothes unrolled, and his shoes flapped on his feet. Each time he could rise, he fell again. It was as if the street were perpendicular before him, and the laughter leaping at his back. He could not find the fence. He did not know which way he was turned. He lay screaming, in blood and dust and darkness. When Big Lanny came home, she found him on the floor in a corner of the room, moaning and whimpering. He still wore his new clothes, cut and torn and dusty, and there was dried blood on his mouth and his palms. Her heart had leapt in alarm when he had not opened the door at her footstep, and she cried out so frantically to ask what had happened that she frightened him into wild weeping. She could not understand what he said. It was something about the street, and laughing at him, and make them go away, and don't let him go in the street no more, never in the street no more. She did not try to make him explain. She took him in her arms and rocked him, and told him, over and over, never mind, don't care, everything's all right. Neither he nor she believed her words. But her voice was soft, and her arms warm. Raymond's sobs softened and trembled away. She held him, rocking silently and rhythmically a long time. Then gently she set him on his feet and took from his shoulders Mr. Ewing's old full-dress coat.